All right, there we go. Getting off to a good start. With Joan Jett. All right, and the Blackhearts. All right. So we are on chapter 22 and 23, doing both of those today. We're going to talk about organic compounds primarily, a little bit of inorganic, but not much, mostly about the organic ones. Now, um, the good news is we're uh, on the third chapter. The bad news is that means it's time for a test. So, guess what? That's right. We will be having a major test. Not only do you turn questions and your quiz, but you will have a test over chapters 20, 21, 22, and 23. So it's 4 chapters, but 3 weeks worth of work. And we got a lot of ground to cover today. So we're going to get kind of right down to it. First of all, what is an organic compound? We hear organic, we think about what we think of as you hear about organic as at the supermarket. If you go to the store and get something that's organic, it means, oh, it doesn't have anything man-made in it or artificial. But organic in a chemistry sense, we're talking about organic chemistry. We're talking about things that contain carbon. In fact, it has its own class at colleges. It has its own people who are organic chemists. They only deal with things that contain carbon. And that's really the bottom line for organic versus inorganic. Okay, lots of man-made chemicals are organic. Why? Plastics, for example, are organic. Why? Because they contain mostly carbon. They're made from oil and crude oil and stuff like that, which are hydrocarbons, which are carbon and hydrogen. That is it, pretty much. Okay, so organic chemistry. Generally, we say that organic compounds are produced by living things. Okay, living things are made out of organic compounds. Carbon, anything that's alive, is a carbon-based life form. Okay, so basically, carbon is the key word here. Okay, generally. Inorganic does not contain carbon and therefore is not produced by living things. We can find them in nature, rocks and grass and so forth. Okay, in general, inorganic are fairly simple machine compounds. They might have, like I think we give the example, I would say calcium sulfate. Okay, it has one calcium, one sulfur, and 4 oxygens, but you total 6. Okay, you can do calcium phosphate. Okay, which actually has 3 of these and 2 of those to balance it, and you got 3 calciums. You got 1 phosphorus with 4 oxygen, both times 2, so that's going to be a total of 10, and 3 give you 13 atoms. Okay, but organic compounds, since they're built by living things, can be built and much more complicated and may have thousands of atoms in one single molecule. For example, starch. In fact, we don't really usually give a formula for starch. We just say CnHNON. Okay, in other words, there's going to be a bunch of them. Okay, we may say there's more of, like say twice as many of these or something, but really we don't even bother counting them. And it can have multiple amounts. Different starch molecules can be longer than others. Okay, so organic chemistry is a little more complicated. That's why it gets us. Follow some different rules and naming, for example, a whole different thing. And we're not going to try to name them. We don't have time for that. But it's a kind of a whole different deal. But it's all about the carbon, okay? All about the carbon, not the pentiums. All about the carbon. All right. Now we're going to talk about hydrocarbons first. Hydro means hydrogen. Carbon means carbon. So basically, these are compounds that are made of hydrogen and carbon. They're just long chains of carbon and hydrogen. Okay. And generally, they're going to be named for how many carbons they have because that's what basically makes it. Okay. And they're a little different than others. For example, say we have 2 carbons joined together, like so. Okay. Well, carbon can have 4 different bonds. If you remember carbon's electron dot thing, it said that there are 4 electrons in the outside layer. So it will usually share with those, and so it can share one up here, one up here, one up here, one up here, and so it can have up to 4 bonds sticking off of it. Okay, one here. All right. And this is one of the things that makes carbon because it can make so many connections, which allows you to build much more complicated structures than you could if they only had one or two that they could build bond. Okay. So, for example, hydrogen only can have one, so it can bond with one other thing, and that's about it. Okay. So if you try to make a chain of hydrogens, two is as much as you can get. Okay. Oxygen, you could have an oxygen bound to an oxygen, bound to another oxygen, bound to another oxygen, but you don't have any bonds to make branches off of it or not, okay? Whereas carbon, you can connect these. If you want to put something else over here, you can start making carbons going up this direction, okay? And then they would have hydrogens on them, all right? They can let go of these two hydrogens here, and they can make what we call a double bond with each other. So they can have 2 bonds with each other. If they wanted to, they can have 3 bonds with each other, which only leaves them with 1 and 1. Now they could have 4 bonds with each other, but then basically that's just a carbon, 2 carbon atoms. You can't get any more. You don't have any room left to build out of that. Okay, but so we don't see triple bonds as often. We don't see quadruple bonds very often, but we do see a lot of these single and double bonds. Okay, and they can do both of those, which allows them to make some bonds that are stronger than others. Okay, and things like that. It allows them a lot of flexibility. Okay, now what's also interesting with um, carbons, oops, goes back on there. Let's put another carbon on here. Um, you can have the same number of carbons and hydrogens. Okay, so if we did the formula for this one, this would be 3 carbons and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hydrogens. So C3H8. And so, oh, that's easy then. That tells you what that one is, right? But you can have different configurations of the same thing. Actually, I should have done this. Let's do this. Let's add one more out here. One more carbon. Okay, which is going to make this carbon 4, and it's going to make it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so we're going to get 10 here. Okay, but what happens is we could do carbons. Oops, like this. Okay, where they're not going to cross pattern. H, 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 H. Okay. We still have 4 carbons, but now we've got a whole different other configuration on it. Okay. Sorry, I didn't do that correctly. All right. And you can have, in this one, you have different amount of carbons on each one, but you can actually have the same number of hydrogens. Okay. I think I'd have to do one with 5, and I don't have time to draw one like that. But you can have different arrangements of the same numbers and be completely different. How they are arranged makes a big difference in how they behave. And they can have exactly the same number of carbons and hydrogens, but if they're rearranged differently, it may be a totally different compound. And those are called structural isomers because isomer, being they look the same, they have the same elements in them, but based on how they're arranged, sometimes even if they're like a mirror image of each other, they will behave totally different. Okay, and so that's unique among organic compounds. You don't find that in inorganic compounds. Okay. Now, as you can see, that gets to be really painful to write after a while because you got all these H's and everything you have to put on. So what we have done is we just put a line, and at the end of the line is a carbon and a carbon. Okay, and then we go to this carbon, so that's another carbon, and we go to another carbon, and we would just write that like that. Everywhere there's an end of a line, here, 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 and here, we would know that means there's a carbon there. Okay. If it's on the end, there would have to be 3 more hydrogens around it to make it solid. This one in the middle, and this one here in the middle, now we've got 2 bonds to the carbon on each side of them, so they need 2 more hydrogens. And we would know over here that this one has to have 3 hydrogens. If there was anything besides a hydrogen, then we would draw that on there. Say, for example, there's a double bond to this carbon up to an oxygen, then we would draw that. Okay. But this way, we don't have to draw all the carbons and hydrogens because that's basically all they are. Why does it tilt up and down? Well, because if you just draw a straight line, you can only have 2 ends, 2 carbons. So just to show that there's a carbon, we make a little point and make the line go in a different direction. and each one of those. So these are called stick figure diagrams, and it just makes it a lot easier to write them so you don't write the whole thing out, okay? Now, what are hydrocarbons? Well, basically, they're things that come from uh, well, coal and petroleum would be the big two, okay? Crude oil, what we get when we dig it straight out of the ground, comes straight out of the ground. Coal that we dig out of the ground, sorry, we drill out of the ground for petroleum. But anyhow, that's basically where they come from. What you think about, remember we said organic has with living things, well, basically coal and gas are, and oil and all that, are from the remains of living things. Coal from plants, petroleum from water animals and stuff that were trapped in the ground, decomposed, and turned into that. So once again, they came from living things at one time, and then we may make plastics out of the oil, for example, or whatever, charcoal or whatever. But they all came from living things. So all the hydrocarbons generally come from what were once living things. So that generally they're most important, like I said, as fuels. Oil and gas and diesel and kerosene and all these things like that, butane, propane, and so forth. But they're also very important for plastics. We've said that's another big thing. Um, and obviously, coal is where the majority of our electricity comes from. Our power plants are powered by coal. So, very important as fuel, but they do have other things that are very important. Now, when they come out of the ground, for example, crude oil, it's got all this stuff mixed together, hence the name crude oil. Okay, as it is heated up to the point that it's vaporized. In other words, it all turns into a gas. Okay, it's run through a fractional distiller, which basically you have this long chamber, and it's hotter down here, and as they rise up here, they get cooler and cooler. Well, some things cool off at a very high temperature while it's still warm. This would be things like asphalt and this tar and things like that, little gooey, gross stuff. Okay, other things like lubricating oils and Vaselines and stuff like that would solidify as they cool off a little bit. Diesel would be higher, kerosene would be higher, gasoline would be higher, natural gas would be taken off as a gas at the top. In fact, they used to, you see sometimes on wells, you'll see just a little pipe coming up and they're lighting it and it's just in flame all the time. As the natural gas comes off, they just burn it off before it goes out into the atmosphere. Okay. Now, if there's a lot of natural gas, then they're going to probably try to contain that. And certainly, like with fracking, where you're trying to get the natural gas, then you're going to keep that and do something with it. But at any rate, this is the way to separate the different parts. Okay, and originally it's going to have all of this, and then as they separate it out and use it for the different things. Okay. Um, Now, just quickly, here's a much better drawing than what I was trying to show you earlier. Um, no, that's not. Never mind. Something else altogether. Okay, but here's what we're going to do next. Okay, so keep in mind, like I said, they can have different formulas, even with the same elements in them and things like that. Now, the other thing you need to know, though, is that you have different, what we call saturated or unsaturated. All right, if you look at this one over here on the side, you'll notice every carbon has how many bonds? 4. And so it either bond to a carbon, or every other bond is taken up by hydrogen, either 2 if it's in the middle, or 3 if it's on the end, because it's going to have 3 hydrogens. All right, we say if all the possible hydrogens that could be put on there are, we say it is saturated. Saturated just means full. So it is full of hydrogens. There are no empty spots. Any of the carbons that do not have the maximum amount. But on the one over here, 2-butene, we have we have these carbons that have a double bond, and so they only have 1 carbon. And normally, if they're in the middle, they should have 2. Okay, so they don't have the maximum. So we would say that this is an unsaturated because it's not full to the maximum of hydrogens. Now, this is similar to what we talk about saturated and unsaturated fats, which also has to do with the number of carbons and whether they have the maximum amount or not. But these are not oils or fats, so therefore they're just hydrocarbons. But saturated means it has a maximum, which also means, or another way of looking at it, all the carbons have single bonds. If any of the carbons have double bonds, then there's unsaturated because that double bond, one of them could be broken and used to attach hydrogens to it. Okay, so that's really basically the difference. Okay, now they can be 1 double bond and be unsaturated. They could have several double bonds and be unsaturated. Okay, you can have a lot of different numbers of double bonds, depending how many carbons you have in the chain, and they would all have these different ones. Now, notice if it ends in ane, like methane, propane, butane, etc., okay, um, that has to do with that they have single bonds. If they have double bonds, then they're butene or propene or so forth, methane and so forth. But we're not going to worry about that too much, but there you go. And I think we said this earlier, and I think it goes into it more. The number of carbons is what they're named for, okay? Of course, I do this off the top of my head, and we'll see if I get this right, but I think methane has one, okay? Uh, butane obviously has three. Propane, I believe, is three, and so forth. Okay, but there's a thing in your book I think talks about how you name them, and in the other lecture talks about it. But anyhow, you get the idea. All right. I thought I had a group of those, but I don't see it now. Okay, so don't worry about that. Okay. Anyhow, um, now besides making chains of carbons like this, where you have four carbons in a row, and this one where you have four carbons hooked in a row, they can also circle back around on themselves and make rings. Okay, we're talking about rings. Um, so if you have these carbons, they can come back around, oops, to each other and make a ring like this, where these carbons join together. All right, and usually to draw this, we just get rid of those. Okay, I'm going to put a sixth carbon down here, so let's do that. And so we usually just draw the structure of these rings. Okay, so I'll cut it there. Well, let's just draw that over again. Okay, so we got chink, 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 chink. Okay, a nice hexagon. So this would have six carbons. Every carbon has two bonds. So that means each one would have two hydrogens because you don't have the ends. So you don't have the end ones, so you no longer have any that have three. Okay, now if they have double bonds, we draw another line inside of this. So that would say these carbons have double bonds. We only have single hydrogen stuck to them. Okay, and so forth. Now, there could be another one of these hooked up this direction. Okay, actually, that's not good. Let me try this again. All right, and you will see formulas that have tons of these, and it looks like a big honeycomb. Okay, and that's just because every time there's two lines come together, there's a carbon. But this carbon right here, for example, already has three bonds, so it would just have one hydrogen coming off of it here. Okay, and so forth. But that would just be the stick figure diagram for these rings. Okay, and once again, that makes them enormously diversified. They can really change a lot and so forth, and so on. All right, so it's just like playing with a bunch of secret toys. There's just an endless number of ways that you can build these carbon molecules because they can make these four different bonds and go off in all these different directions. All right, now if you want to, we're going to talk about types of hydrocarbons, okay? Now, types of hydrocarbons, I'm mostly going to be concerned with you being able to recognize them if you have a chart, okay? I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of these. That's kind of silly, okay? But say you see a formula of these, and you want to know what kind of chemical it is, all right? Say we have this one. We'll just do this, okay? And a double bond O and an OH coming off here. Now, technically, an OH would have an O attached to the H, but you know, we usually draw it like that. Okay. All right. So if I draw this one, all right, hang on, let me see. If I want to name it, I need to find the hetero atom. Hetero means different, just like heterosexual means you have two different sexes. Homosexual means one or the same. Okay, so we want to know what are the atoms that are different than carbon and hydrogen, because we know carbon and hydrogen, yeah, they're all full of carbon and hydrogens, right? Okay, but we want to look at the hetero atom. So key things here, we have a double bond oxygen, which is called a carbonyl group, kind of like a hydroxyl. Remember, we had the hydroxide. It's called a hydroxyl group. Well, carbonyl just means, in this case, there's a double bond O stuck to it. Okay, and then you have the OH down here, technically the O, which is attached to the H. but that would be the hydroxyl, okay, and so forth. So you have these groups, all right? You kind of ignore, cross out all the C's and H's. Now the C that's attached there, you might leave it there, okay? It's attached to one of these heteroatoms, but those are what make them special, okay? Otherwise, they're just long chains of hydrogen and carbons, and that's all there is to them, okay? They either have single bonds or double bonds, and the rest are all hydrogens, and that's it, because they're hydrocarbons. But what makes the different uniques is that if you add different groups to it, different functional groups, we call them, then they change what they do. They may do totally different things, okay? Which once again increases how diverse and useful they can be inside human bodies, okay? All right, so basically, the heteroatoms are what make things different, okay? And so that's kind of what we're looking at there. And that's what we need to know because that helps us to tell what kind it is. Okay, so for example, we're just going to start off with a very basic one, and we're just going to use 2 or 3 carbons on it. Okay. Well, let's just do it even easier than that. Let's just make it with one group. So we have this hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. Okay. All right. So you got the hydrogen and the carbon. They don't count. But you have this OH group. Anytime there's just an OH group stuck on that, that's the only, make sure there's not anything else attached there. But if that's the only heteroatom, then this is an alcohol. All right. You got ethanol. All right. And you got methanol. Okay. And you've got propanol. You got isopropanol, which is what we call rubbing alcohol. Okay. The meth and the eth and the propanol and butanol and whatever that part only has with how many carbons. But basically, there's going to be carbons, only how many carbons with an OH at the end. Okay. And that OH at the end is what makes it an alcohol. And notice ethanol, methanol, propanol, they all end in OL. If you see a name of a chemical, especially in organics, that OL at the end, it's probably some type of alcohol. Okay? So that kind of makes sense. Not to be confused with overhaul, that's a different word. Doing in motors or something, okay? But in general, if there's an OH group, it's going to be an alcohol. Now, let's just say we had another alcohol over here. Okay? Let's make it the same kind. Why not? Okay, I'm not going to put all the H's over here, but just know it has an O and an H over here. So this is an alcohol, it has an OH group. This is an alcohol because it has an OH group. Although that looks like a D. Don't ask me why I did that, but there we go. Okay, O and H. All right, now, if they were to react with each other, guess what we could do? We could take one of these hydrogens and the hydrogen and the oxygen over here, and we could make, drum roll please, water. That's right. So we take off water. And when we do that, we have an oxygen that needs to have 2. It was connected to the carbon and a hydrogen. Over here, we had a carbon that would still have its hydrogens up here, but it needs one more connection. So this oxygen and this carbon are just going to connect to each other. Okay. Now we have a carbon chain that has an oxygen stuck in the middle of it. Okay. And this is what we call an ether. Okay, so now we put 2 alcohols together, we can form an ether. All right. Originally, ether was a very strong, and these still are used versions of it, but ether is a very strong anesthetic. Okay, put people under, put them asleep. Okay, things like that. All right. And so forth. All right. So that's basically ether. Okay. So they're very similar to each other, and they're related because one can be used to create the other one. If you take 2 alcohol groups together, then you could end up with an ether. Now, there are other ways of doing it. In fact, organic chemists spend their time just putting different groups on different compounds and seeing if they come up with something useful. But sometimes they do it on purpose. Sometimes they're just trying to check it out and see what will happen. Okay. All right. Now, another type is an amine. Okay. An amine. First of all, let's again go back to our basic carbon structure here. We'll use 1 carbon to make it simple. All right. And it is going to have a nitrogen on the end of it. Okay, now nitrogen We had carbon, which can have four. We have hydrogen that can only have one. We talked about oxygen can have two bonds. Nitrogen needs three. So usually that's going to be this, or we could write this as just NH2 on the end. And that's just another way to write it, so we don't have to show all the hydrogens up there. Okay, but it's going to have usually a nitrogen with a couple hydrogen stuff on it there. Okay, and so that would be an amine. Okay, amine sounds a lot like an amino acid. Okay, and amino acids do have at least part of them looks like has an amine group on it. Okay, all right. Guess what other group they have? That's right, an acid group. But we'll get to that in a minute. About organic groups. Now, let's talk about some things that have the oxygen, double bond oxygen. We talked about that a minute ago. We're going to add a couple more C's here just to make it more interesting here. All right. Now, the first one we're going to talk about are ketones. Okay? And ketones are where you have a double bond oxygen in the middle. I'll just throw these other carbons on there. All right. So you have a double bond oxygen right in the middle, and that is considered a ketone. All right. So, what are ketones? Good question. Right there. Ketones are basically when you have it in the middle. They are used as scents or flavorings. A lot of them are. There's one of your flower scents, lemons. What's they got? Cinnamon. We got almonds. We got vanillin. Especially they make it from wood pulp. It's a ketone that has that. Old books sometimes has a nice smell. And part of it is the chemicals in the wood break down over time, and acids and stuff get to them, and the air and your fingers and stuff like that. And they break it down and they release basically vanillin. So it's kind of vanilla scented books, if you will. All right. So those are ketones. Okay. Now, if it's at the end of one, let's just say we moved it down here to the end. Okay, but it's double bonded, so we're going to have to get rid of one of those hydrogens. So this one just has hydrogen. If we have a double bond over here, that you just have an O and H on the end, that is an aldehyde. Okay. Now, aldehyde you may recognize. Formaldehyde is one of the most common ones we've probably heard of. Okay. So aldehydes have a double bond over per vinyl group, but they only have it on the end. So if it's in the middle, it's a ketone. If it's on the end, it's an aldehyde. So as you can imagine, these are very common. If you had one in the middle and you split it off, you could probably create a ketone from that. I mean, ketone. Sorry, use a ketone where it's in the middle, and if you cut it off, then it would make an aldehyde out of it. Okay, aldehyde, like I said, the most common one probably heard of it is formaldehyde. But I said a lot of these can also keep things from rotting and things like that. But a lot of them are a lot of the flavorings and smells and odors that we smell are. Going back to amines, I'm sorry, besides amino acids, we'll talk about later, but also some of the salts in caffeine, the tannins in tea that give it its flavor and stuff like that, are also amines. I'm sorry, I didn't say that earlier. I did that. Okay. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is an amide. Ooh, an amide. That gets more complicated, doesn't it? Okay, and so an amine or amide, if you remember, amine just had a nitrogen group attached to it. Okay, in this case, we have a double bond O and a nitrogen, and that is an amide, I-D-E. Okay, now this could be connected to other carbons, or it could have just the two hydrogens stuck off of it. Okay, but whatever. If you have a double bond O, the carbonyl group, and you have a nitrogen group, or which would be like the amine group, okay, you get an amide. Okay, amides we're not worry too much about, but DEET, the main ingredient in off that keeps the mosquitoes off of us and stuff like that, is in fact one of these amides. Okay, all right. Now we're talking about organic acids. Okay, organic acids have a double bond O, but they also have an OH in here, which remember is actually O joined to an H. Okay, so if you have a double bond O and an OH, remember OH by itself is an alcohol. Double bond O by itself on the end would be an aldehyde, or if it's in the middle, would be a ketone. Okay, but if you have both of them together, then you have a organic acid, or they call it carboxylic or carboxylic acid. Because when you have these two together, it's called a carboxyl group. Okay, I'm not going to worry so much about, like I said, once again, naming the groups as much as I just want you to be able to recognize it. If I give you a sheet where it shows you the general format, you can say, oh, this one must be. So once again, you cross off all the hydrogens and the carbons and say, oh, look at that. You got too many bonds there. Sorry, got to get rid of that when we double bonded over there. Okay, so I've got 4 bonds there. So if you got a double bond O and an OH group, then that is an organic acid. Now that's so confusing because we said in inorganic compounds, we said that an OH group usually meant that it could be base. But in this case, you put this in water, the hydrogen separates off. And if you give off hydrogens when you get in water, guess what? You're an acid. Okay. So if since it just gives off the hydrogen, not the whole OH group, then we would consider this an acid because it's going to donate a proton or a hydrogen ion. Okay? All right. Some of you may have heard of is carboxylic acid, acetic acid, and vinegar. Things like those. Those are some common organic acids. A lot of things in your organic things, living things, are acidic. So they're fairly common. All right. Now, if we were to join something to this, all right, and we have another carbon chain over here, and we were to take off this oxygen and take off the lead or something over here, a hydrogen or whatever, then we could hook them together. Now we've got a double bond O. Instead of an OH group, we have an O that hooks up to another chain over here. Okay, and this is going to be an ester. So basically, if you react a organic acid with something that takes the H off and hooks it to another chain over here, you're going to have some kind of ester. Okay, not ester in the Bible. Well, that's a whole different kind of ester, but that's with an H in ESTHER. Okay, but esters are going to be similar to what we talked about with ketones and aldehydes. A lot of flavorings, rum, banana, orange, apple, wintergreen, all these kind of flavorings. All of those are esters. So once again, it's a big group for flavorings and things like that we taste. All right. Now, let's take a pause for a minute, and we're going to come back and talk about polymers because polymers will be important. All right. Another characteristic of carbons that makes them so versatile is that a lot of times you take one that has a double bond like this, and what it will do, they can break the double bond, but instead of adding a hydrogen, they will take that bond over here and they will join with another of the same units, okay? So say you had another one over here, they break their bond, they join up there and they join up here, and same thing happens on this side, same thing, it keeps going. They just keep adding on and on and on, and these are called addition polymers because you're just adding another unit on, okay? So these are addition polymers, okay? And polymer, poly means many, so when you get many or more than one of these units, it's called a polymer, okay? And it can just keep going, and it can do this for thousands of times and get long, long, long strands, okay? But basically, when you have these small monomers, okay, this would be a monomer, this one over here would be a monomer, and you keep doing every 2 carbons was originally a separate unit, and these are called monomers or single units, okay? One, mono means one, so 1 unit, and you hook them together to make polymers, and you can just go on and on and on, and this is basically where a lot of our plastics have come from. HDPE, which I think is high density polystyrene, I believe. But there's also LDPE, which is low density polystyrene. This is a lot of our plastics that we have. If it's high density, it tends to be more rigid. I think there's low density, it tends to be more bendable, okay? Some of these are flexible, some of them are not, so it depends. Styrene, which is basically the foam that we use to make styrofoam. They had styrene was the unit, and then they heated it. Now, when they heated it, it bubbled, and originally they were trying to do some stuff with the styrene, all right, and so they it kept foaming up. So they took this foam off the top, plunked it over here, said, "Hey, we need to get rid of the stuff that's in the way." And then later they came back and said, "Oh, this is kind of neat. It's got air bubbles in it, and it solidified and kind of got hard, and it made styrofoam, basically." Okay, and so that was kind of cool. Polystyrene, the clear plastic cups that we have, you know, we have a lot of those. Um, PVC is one of these addition polymers, all PVC pipes. PVC is also very common in shower curtains, and I believe they make clothes out of it and stuff like that. You can do a lot of different things with it. But basically, um, um, it gives you characteristics of some are flexible, some are rigid, very cheap, very strong, some are very strong, very light. Uh, the cars, for example, weigh much less today because of some other things, but part of it is plastic polymers that they've been able to use instead of metals and things like that. And so the car weighs a lot less, and that can be very good. Now, there are some problems. There have been. There are what they call plasticizers, things that help them to do this polymer process, shower curtains and stuff like that. And at one time they have what they call phthalates, kind of like the phenolphthalein. Okay, phthalates, Phthalates, phthalates. Okay, and they cause reproductive damage. Okay, particularly in fetuses and young children and stuff like that. So they have been outlawed. So there are, you have, once again, you're dealing with new materials, you've got to be careful with that. Okay, there can be problems, but um, and occasionally they still find a few things with different kind of plastics, and oh, that's not gonna work, so we have to try to do something different. Okay, Saran wrap is another example. Um, Teflon, kind of interesting. Cling wrap or plastic wrap, saran wrap, we want it to cling to things, and it does because it has chlorine in it that has uh, chlorine has a negative charge, which gives it a charge, and then um, it will be attracted, it can induce a charge in whatever you're sticking it to, so it'll stick to it. Some wraps, plastic wraps, especially off brands, some work great, some don't work so great, depending on how well they do that. Teflon does just the opposite. It doesn't want to stick to things, so nothing sticks to it. Okay, and so basically, it's used for things like skillets and so forth that we don't want anything to stick to. Now, there's another group called condensation polymers. All right. The second, let me get a drawing up, and then we'll talk about that for a second. All right. Say we have an alcohol. Here's the OH group. This is OH group. So, no, it's a HO group. Well, but it's the same thing. It's O and H together. Okay. But just to show what it would really look like, we're putting it like that because you would have oxygen hooked to the hydrogen, and this oxygen would be hooked to that hydrogen. All right. Now, when these two come together, they can do kind of like we talked about earlier. You have one of the hydrogens here and one of the OHs here. They go off and make water, and now you have this oxygen and this carbon that both need another bond, so they just hook up with each other. Okay, and so this would be a way to hook up and make what we said the ethers. Okay, we could do that, but it's giving off. You're taking water off, so sometimes it's called condensation because it produces water. Okay, kind of like when water vapor condenses and forms water on the outside of your cup. So it's called condensation polymers. When we do this in the body, we call it dehydration synthesis. Why? Because you're dehydrating, taking water out, and using it to hook things together. We'll talk more about that later, but that's basically the same kind of reaction. You're taking water out of it, and use that to hook these monomers together to make long chains of polymers. So addition, you're breaking the double bonds, and that allows them to hook up with people next to them. And they keep doing that over and over. This one, you're taking out water, and it allows them to hook up with each other. Same general idea. You're taking monomers, hooking them together, just a little different process of doing it. Okay, nylon is one very common. PET, a lot of plastic bottles, and some of the clothing is made out of. That's good. Mylar, which is like the helium balloons, the little shiny ones, you know, and stuff that you get. Thermoset plastics. These are ones that once you set them, they won't melt. They're in that shape. Okay. Once you originally make it, heat it, and form it to a certain shape, but once it sets, then it stays in that shape. Okay. So that's very good. Um, Malmac, which for all time we had Bakelite dishes and Bakelite radios, hard plastic radios and old-fashioned radios. You'll see it a lot in dishes and stuff like that. But Formica is made from a similar process like that. Okay, so those are all condensation polymers. Now, do I want you to memorize which ones are which? No, but I do want you to know what a condensation polymer is and what an addition polymer is. Okay. All right, and like I said, on the quiz, I will and test. I will expect you if I give you a list of like here's the C with an OH sticking off of it is an alcohol, and here's with C with the strand on this side and a strand on that side is an ether group, etc. I would expect you to be able to identify. Tell me if I give you a compound, cross off all the C's and H's, what's left, and look at the heteroatoms, and tell me which of these groups it will go into. But I will give you a chart like this on the quiz or test, so you don't need to memorize all of that. You just need to be able to memorize, be able to identify it and find it on this list and check it out. Okay. The other thing is, yeah, know what they're used for. Just the general uses. Ethers used for an anesthetic. Esters and ketones and aldehydes are flavorings and scents and things like that. Okay. That's kind of what we're looking for. All right. Now we're going to shift a little bit. We're still going to be talking about organic compounds, but we're going to go and talk about biochemistry, which just means chemicals used, organic chemistry really, used in living things. We're talking about the four main groups, which you've heard of before, so it's not really new stuff to you, but hopefully we'll understand them better than we did before. All right, before we talk too much though about the organic compounds, I want to talk about some inorganic compounds that are very important to living things. So we're bringing a little bit of that inorganic stuff here. And some we've already talked about in other classes. Okay, for example, water, H2O. Well, obviously it's not organic because it has no carbon in it, right? It's just hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, a couple reasons why it's the most important solvent. You can use it to dissolve things. Why? Because it's a dipole. It has a polarity, so you have positive side and negative side. And it makes things dissolve really easy in it. Okay, it's one of the best things for that. So that's important. Things that don't dissolve in it can be suspended in it, or they can form colloids where they just stay suspended in it. It'll never come out. Okay, that's also very important. Okay, blood is a colloid. Milk is a colloid or suspension. So we really, it's very important for getting chemicals spread out in something, either dissolving or just being suspended or as a colloid. Um, that does that. And that allows, that liquid allows them to carry those chemicals around, or blood cells in the case, and get oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from your lungs to the parts of your body that need it, and so forth. So it allows for things to move around in the organism, okay? And now we have blood. Some things may have sap if it's a plant, or it may have water if it's like a jellyfish or something. But there's got to be some kind of water-based fluid inside, insect, whatever, that circulates things around. So it's very important. Also, it has a high specific heat, which means it can soak up a lot of heat without the temperature getting hot. So we can go out in the sun and soak up a lot of heat. Our temperature does not go up very fast. So that's good. We talked about that. Chemical reactivity, we'll talk more about this. It can actually be used to put things together or split them apart, just like we had the condensation where we take water out and it hooks things together or synthesizes them, puts them together. You can also add water to things and it breaks them back apart. This allows our bodies to put things together, take them apart using water, which we are, 75, 80%, whatever, water. It's a bunch of our body. It's easy to do, and it works out really well that way. All right, and then the last thing is probably cushioning. We have fluids that cushion our brain. We have, when a woman's pregnant, the fluids around the baby, amniotic fluid, helps cushion it so that if she gets bumped or jostled, hopefully it will not harm the baby. The cerebral spinal fluid, CSF, around our brain, also around our spinal cord, going around here, has that. This is going to help cushion it and keep bad things from happening. Okay. Another one is O2. All right, we've done the example before. If you light a candle and put a thing over it, what happens? It goes out. Okay, that's important for us. I will ask, guaranteed, on the quiz and the test, why do living things need oxygen? And people are going to say, oh, they need to breathe. Oh, so they don't suffocate. So they don't. No, but why do they need to breathe? Why do they suffocate when they don't get oxygen? What is the deal? Why is oxygen? Just like that candle. we need oxygen to burn things. Now, we don't burst into flames, hopefully, in our stomach and whatever, or in our cells, but we add oxygen to it and we burn it or oxidize it, and it releases energy. And so we must have oxygen in our cells to oxidize our food and get energy from it. Okay, so remember that. The last one is CO2, which is the gas we breathe out, but as a waste product, but plants take it in, and this is where all the carbon in living things come from. Okay, I know it has carbon in it. We say carbon should be organic, but in this case, carbon dioxide is considered inorganic because there is carbon dioxide out there that we did not make. Okay, we put the carbon oxygen together. It's just there as a gas that's present. Now, the important thing is though, we breathe it out as a waste product. We break down parts of our body and give off carbon dioxide. We breathe that out. Okay, but the carbon that's in our body, where did it come from? Well, it came from plants, or we ate animals that ate plants. Well, where did the plants get it? Well, they took carbon dioxide out of the air and turned it into sugar. Okay, that's what photosynthesis is all about. That's why it's a big deal, and you have to study it in biology and everything. Why? Because you're taking an inorganic gas, carbon dioxide, and you're making it into organic things that contain carbon, and everything in your body, most of which contains carbon, that carbon came from carbon dioxide that a plant put into effect. That's what I call producers. Why? Because they produce the carbon compounds that the rest of us need to live. All right. So very important. Say thank you to a plant today if you haven't already. All right. Now let's talk about organic compounds. All right. Once again, contain carbon. They tend to be very complicated and complex. Lots of atoms in them, things like that. All right. Very often polymers, where you have a bunch of monomers hooked together. We've kind of talked about that already, so we're not going to go into it. First one is CHO. It's almost like a hydrocarbon, but it's a carbohydrate. If you remember, ATE on the word means it's added oxygen to it. So carbon plus hydrogen and water, or another way to think about it, they're hydrated. If you add water, hydrated, to carbon, then you get CHO, which are carbohydrates. So hydrated carbons, water added to carbon, boom, guess what? Now you've got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So those are the three elements that are in these. Now they may also have a few other odd things stuck into them, but for the most part, they're carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All right. Now, we're going to talk about carbohydrates. First one is, we're just going to draw it like this. That's a little simple for what a glucose molecule would look like. And technically, I believe one of these is an oxygen right here, and there's some other thing sticking off. But we're not going to worry about that. Okay, represents a glucose molecule. All right, and it's a single sugar. Okay, one of the biggest groups of carbohydrates is sugars. Something about carbs, and something about sugars. Well, technically, they're all carbs, okay? Sugars are just a type of carb. And if it's just one molecule, then it is a mono or simple sugar. Sometimes we call it a simple sugar or a monosaccharide. Ooh, good word, okay? Mono means one. Saccharide, you may have heard of saccharin, the artificial sweetener, it means sweet. So one sweet or one sugar, okay? That's all it means. All right? Now, some of these, glucose that plants make, that's the most important one. Fructose, which is also made by plants sometimes. Galactose, ribose, and deoxyribose, which you may not remember, but that's the R and the D in DNA. So technically, no matter how nasty someone seems, at their core, in their DNA and their RNA, they're sweet. All right, they have a sugar in there. It's called ribose and deoxyribose. Okay, so anyhow, those are monosaccharides. Now, you can hook these together because guess what? They have an OH group here. If you get another sugar with an OH group here, guess what? You can take out water, two hydrogens and oxygen, and you can hook them together. Now you have two sugars hooked together. That is a disaccharide. I spelled that right, but anyhow. Disaccharide, okay? So a disaccharide just means a double sugar. Sucrose, table sugar, what we call sugar if we're at the breakfast table, all right, is actually a combination of two sugars. All right, I believe glucose and fructose. Okay, so it's a little bit of both of those. All right, lactose in milk is another double sugar. Maltose, which is in grain, and that's the sugar they use to ferment with yeast to ferment and make beer and all the different kind of alcohol drinks. A lot of those come from not wine, it's grape usually, but all the beers and so forth. A lot of them come from maltose, the sugar that's there. Okay, those are double sugars or disaccharides. Now, the last group is what most people think of when we talk about. Um, if you get more than that, I mean, you could have tri and quad saccharides and whatever, but eventually we just talk about polysaccharides, which just means many. So you have a whole bunch. You can just keep hooking these together and together and together. Now, most of them are not sweet tasting, okay? At least when you just that part by itself. But they are polysaccharides, um, and your body uses as a way to store these. If you think about it, you're taking water out, you're drying it out, which is dehydrating, which is a way we store things. Okay, well, your body does the same thing. It takes out the water, makes these long chains of starch, and then when your body says, "Hey, I need some," so let's add a little water, break one of those off. Okay, and so it's a way to store. In plants, we call it starch. Okay, in animals we call it glycogen. Glycogen. Okay, but basically it's the same thing. It's just that whether it's a plant or an animal. All right, your liver, for example, stores glycogen, doesn't store starch. Okay, now the starch made the sugar molecules they use to make glycogen and store it in your liver may have come from starch or sugars that you ate. Okay, and then it stores it as a glycogen. All right. Now the other part that's very important about polysaccharides, besides the starch and glycogen, would also be cellulose. All right, you may have recognized that from talking about um, plants. Their cell walls are made out of cellulose, which makes them rigid. They have no bones, so they need something to hold them upright. And you have trees and stuff like this have lots of cellulose in them. Okay, so we're talking about cells. We talk about cellulose in the cell walls, but if we're talking about this in our food when we eat it, we call it fiber. Okay, that's all fiber is. It's a cellulose. You can't really digest it, but it does help these foods move through your body. It keeps cleaning out your, pushing everything along so it doesn't get all gooey and just stick on the sides of the walls. And it does help with cancer. It helps make it more regular and all. You've heard all the advantages of fiber, but basically, that's what this is. This is stuff we can't digest, but it is good for your body to move stuff through. And so, like I said, these are formed by dehydration synthesis. You take water out, put them together. Same thing as condensation polymers, but except for now we're doing it with carbohydrates. Okay, and you can add water to them and break them back apart, and then burn them for sugars. So you've already heard that you need to eat lots of carbs if you're going to do, say, a marathon. Why? Well, so that you have a lot of stuff that your body can add water to and break off sugars as you need it. If you're stupid enough to run for however many hours and 26 miles or whatever, and try to survive, you're going to need lots of sugar along the way. So it stores it and gives you a little bit of time as you need it during that longer race. Okay. Last thing about carbohydrates is carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. All right. It doesn't matter if it's sugar, doesn't matter if it's starch, but there's 4 calories of food or energy per gram of it. Okay. All right. So let's go to the next one. After carbohydrates, we have lipids. All right. So lipids. Some say, well, what's a lipid? I don't know if I've ever had a lipid before. Okay. Yes, you have. All right. You may have called it a lipid. Okay. Generally speaking, there are fats if it's solid, liquid if it's oil if it's a liquid, and waxes, which are kind of in between. They can be whatever. Okay. What do we use lipids for? Well, the key thing is they store energy, just like starch did. Starch stores energy, whereas we burn sugars for energy. Starch, we store the energy. But if we really want to put it in deep storage for a long time, we're going to use it as a fat. Okay. And that's what our fat is. We have these love handles and whatever on the side, right? Okay, that's storage. You're trying to say, hey, I'm gonna put some of that food down here, maybe I'll need it later. Okay, most of us know that's why we keep putting more and more down there, and we end up with more than we need. But that's a whole different story. Okay, but lipids are for long-term storage. If your body is looking for energy, it's going to go to sugars first, then starches, and then if it needs it, it will go to lipids. Okay, and then if it gets really desperate, it'll go for protein to start digesting your muscles, and that's why people are starving always have very thin, emaciated. Why? Because they're body is trying to digest their muscle tissue. But yeah, but lipids are they're not one of the first things your body does, and so that's why it's so hard to get rid of fat deposits once you have them. But it's good. It does protect us. It also, we have lipids in our cell walls that help protect them, and fat under our skin. It helps insulate us from the uh, cold and stuff like that. So they're not totally bad, obviously. They're not soluble in water because we know that oils and fats and water do not mix because they're non-polar, whereas water is polar and they don't want to mix. Okay. But the key thing is they have 9 calories per gram. In other words, I can store twice as much energy and a little bit more. There's only 4 calories per gram in carbohydrates. So if I store energy in a carbohydrate, it would take twice as much by weight to store the same amount of energy. All right. Now the good news is that means if I'm storing it as fat, I don't need nearly as much of it, so I don't weigh as much. Okay, I have to take twice as much to store to start, twice as much weight up. But the bad news is, if you're trying to get rid of it, you're going to have to do twice as much exercise to get rid of 9 calories versus the 4 calories in a gram of starch. So it's harder to get rid of because it's more energy. Okay. So anyway, all right. And when we talk about phospholipids on the soap, they have a positive and negative end. One is hydrophilic, loves water. One hates it. I'm not going to go into that a lot right now. But the other thing is steroids. Talk about steroids. These are also lipids. All right, and we tend to think of steroids as, ooh, that's bad. All we're saying is anabolic steroids are really just testosterone, basically, or things that can be turned into testosterone. And so if it wasn't for cholesterol, that's where some steroids come from, all right, cholesterol is used to make testosterone. That's good. Now, if you take too much of it, and anabolic steroids to bulk up and all this other stuff, then you may get some other bad effects from it, okay? But cholesterol is very important to your body, very necessary. A lot of hormones and vitamins and something called bile salts that we need that help digest your food. You definitely, or change the pH stuff in your body, you need cholesterol. It's just that we get too much, it's like a food in general. You get too much of it, then it can become a bad thing. Okay? And it can start clogging up arteries and whatever. But cholesterol is very essential to our bodies. It's just that we tend to end up eating a lot more than we need to. All right. Now, let's talk about proteins real quick. Proteins are polymers, long chains, built by your cells. Okay, they have to be built by your cell. You eat protein, but that protein does not become protein in your body. It gets broken down into small groups called amino acids. That's the small monomers that it's made out of. They hook together, we call the amino acids together to get a protein. And so your body eats protein and breaks it down into amino acids. Then you may reuse those amino acids to build protein, but it's not like you eat protein, so automatically you'll start putting on more muscle. You have to actually exercise it so your body will start building it and organizing it and making it into new muscle. All right? Not a direct transfer thing. Okay? And proteins could have hundreds or thousands of amino acids hooked together. Then they have to be folded in a particular shape, and a very complicated thing. Good thing your body does it without you having to worry about it. Okay, things like collagen and keratin are good. Enzymes we've talked about, which are basically organic catalysts found in living things that speed up reactions, make them happen faster, or help take things apart. And things like that. One thing you'll see a lot of times, say we have lactose. You've heard people are lactose intolerant. Well, OSC, remember glucose, fructose, lactose, all those. Okay, all the sugars have OSC as an ending. If you have enzymes that help break those down, they usually have ASC. So people who are lactose intolerant don't have enough lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, and that's why they get gas and various digestive problems when they drink milk, which has lactose in it. Okay, so you can either get milk that doesn't have lactose, so the lactose has been taken out, or you can drink or take some lactase, Lactaid, I think is tablets, but basically has lactase in it that will help you break down it and it won't be a problem. Okay, and the proteins also have 4 calories per gram. Okay, and so they can be used for energy. So that's usually kind of a last-ditch effort in your body to do that. All right, the last type of organic compound that's important in your body is Na, nucleic acids. Nucleic because they're in the nucleus. All right, And so DNA, which is deoxyribo, remember that sugar we said, deoxyribose? Okay, deoxyribose sugar is DNA. And if you have ribose sugar, so ribonucleic acid, that is um, RNA. Okay? Basically, the polymers made out of a whole bunch of things called nucleotides. All right. And you hook all these nucleotides together, and you end up with a DNA or RNA. There's some differences. RNA is one strand. DNA, we know, has two strands. It comes across, look at the ladder that's been twisted. Okay. They have different sugars, obviously. DNA has deoxyribose. RNA has ribose. Um, they have slightly different bases. Okay. They all have G and C and A, but then you can either have T and DNA, which is thymine, or you can have U, which is uracil and RNA. Probably a way for your body to easily differentiate which one's DNA, which one's RNA. Okay. Now, DNA is the instructions for how to build all the proteins in your body that you need to function properly. Okay. And every cell has a complete copy of the DNA in it. RNA helps read it and build all those different proteins. So they're all kind of in the protein production business. Okay. Just a matter of which part of they are. All right. Now we've been long on lecture. Time to do some demos. All right, here we're back. We're going to do some tests. First of all, we're going to do, this is sugar. We're just going to put some dissolved sugar water here. I'll put sugar in it. Table sugar. Sucrose. Okay. I'm going to put a test tube of that. Here. Now, in order to test for it, you may have done this in school, but it's been different lengths of time for people, so we'll go ahead and put this. I'm going to put about, this is Benedict's solution. I'm going to put it like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. No magic formula, but I'm not going to put enough in there, okay? And you might tell us it's slightly blue, but that's pretty much nothing happens. Pretty exciting, huh? Now we're going to put it back here in a beaker of water, which is boiling, and see what happens. That's the actual test. Putting it in, nothing happens no matter what, okay? Now we're going to take this as starch. Now this is, you can see it's still kind of cloudy. This is potato starch. Instead of it's soluble in water, it's better than cornstarch, but as you can tell, it's not real soluble in water apparently. Now it's kind of cloudy. We're going to put some solution in there. All right, there we go. And it can also turn light blue and cloudy still. And we're going to put it in the hot water bath and see what happens. Now, the last one is cornstarch, which remember is mostly fructose, high fructose corn syrup. They talk about been vilified. Basically, it's a sugar, just like other sugars, and it's very debatable whether there's much difference in how your body uses fructose than any other sugar. But there was an announcement that they started calling it, they were going to call it corn sugar, because cornstarch has a bad name, but really, reputation, but really it's not. In other words, sugar, and all has 4 calories per gram. And the claim is that there's some difference in how your body processes it. You can see it's still just kind of clear, slightly blue maybe, but we're going to put those in there and let them sit for a little while, turn up the heat, and see what happens, okay? All right, while we're waiting for that, though, we're going to do a starch test. If you want to test for starch, which is this cloudy stuff here, all right, that is fairly easy to do. All right, take starch, now take iodine. Notice how brown and stuff it is on the outside because it has iodine in it, and it still tends to want to react like that. Now, if I were to put this in just water, it would just turn kind of yellowy because the brown would turn to a lighter color. But if I stick it in here, it's going to not. And that's not very impressive. Okay, hang on. We're going to have to change that in a second. All right, so we have stirred up the starch, get a little more in it. Let's put it in here. You can already see it's changing a little color on the bottom, but let's put this in there. A lot more starch. Oh, must have been my iodine. That was not very strong. Let me see here. Yeah, very weak solution there. Sorry. But you can see as it turns in, it should turn a dark color. And I was assuming that wasn't strong enough. Apparently, it's my iodine solution not very. Definitely has a dark color. If you had very strong iodine solution, it should turn a nice purpley color, almost black. Okay, but definitely a reaction there. And so starch test positive for that. All right. Now we're going to look at our ones that we've been heating, and you will notice right off the bat that one of them, corn syrup, tested positive for sugar, which is not surprising because it has fructose in it, right? Okay. Um, our starch, on the other hand, still looks pretty much like it did before. I haven't seen much change there. So we're just going to say, oh, well, let's leave the starch there. Okay. And it's not doing anything, but it's not sugar. It's a bunch of sugars hooked together. Now, what might be a little more surprising is that the sugar has failed the sugar test. Okay, it is still has kind of light bluish green color to it. It's not really changing very much. Well, why not? If it's a sugar, obviously it should have sugar in it. Well, technically it is a simple sugar test. That's why starch does not test positive. And that is why sucrose does not, because sucrose, remember, is glucose and fructose put together, so it's actually a double sugar. All right, so it does not test positive because it's not a double sugar. All right, so uh, that's that. And let me get one more demo, and then we'll be done. All right, last thing we're going to do today is a calorie measure. And once again, you may have done this in high school, I don't know, but we're going to do it now just to make sure. All right, and this looks a lot like a paperclip, but it's actually a calorimeter or a calorie measure. Really well, it's really just a paperclip. It's been bent out of shape, but it's going to hold our sacrifice, burnt offering, in this case pecan, on it, hopefully nicely. We'll see. All right, now, technically we'd need this in a sealed chamber, so none of the heat could escape. But we're going to light this, and we would also have a sample of water up here measuring how the temperature of it changes, so we know exactly how much heat is coming off of this. But we don't have thousands of dollars for a real calorimeter, so we are going to use this one. All right. Now we're going to heat it and try to catch it on fire. This is a pecan, apple pecan, and we want to know how many calories it has. Okay, and we would do that by burning it and releasing the energy. All right, and so there it is. You can see it's burning pretty well. It's burning the pecan at both ends, so to speak. All right, not to be confused with burning the candle at both ends. All right, and it's burning pretty good. All right, well, let it get going. Keep going. And we'll do some other ones just for comparison purposes. Now, like I said, if we wanted to be official, we'd have to trap the heat in. We would have to measure the temperature of the water. All right. This one we're going to use is a Frito. All right. See if we can get it to light up. Oops, there we go. Almost got it to my hand, but not quite. So it's going to start burning. We'll see how that does. And then we have a Dorito over here. That's not good. All right. That's too much like it. Let's try some Cheerios. Cheerios are nice because we just kind of hang them on there. Now, also, if we really wanted to compare the calories from each of these, we would have to measure out exactly the same amount of mass or food particles that we're eating. For example, we could do a marshmallow, but marshmallows don't burn very long, you notice, whereas these have still been burning both of them for quite some time. Okay, both our pecan and our other one. All right, let's see how these Cheerios do. Cheerios look fairly flammable. Let's see how they do. Are they on fire? Yes, they are. It's a very lighter colored flame, but they're burning pretty good, actually. All right. Burning quite quickly. And they do burn good, but then they burn out. All right, our pecan has just gone out. Our Cheerios have gone out, but our Frito is going quite well still, and actually burning strong. But it's about to go out too. Now, like I said, we'd have to have exactly the same amount. The Frito was a little bigger. But based on this, it should tell us enough which food group burns the best. What do nuts have in them and Fritos have in them that allow them to burn better? Well, we know the one with the most calories, therefore the most energy, are lipids, okay, or fats. And of course, the pecans have a great deal of oil, so nuts burn very well, very long, and very cleanly. How about that? Don't sneak as bad. All right. Fritos, lots of oil. In fact, there's a little puddle of oil down here underneath. I don't know if you can see that on there, but there's actually a little puddle of oil underneath the Frito. Okay. So it didn't all burn up. There was even more oil. Could have kept it there. And the Fritos, the Cheerios burn really good, but they didn't last very long, okay, because they don't have their fairly low fat, and so the carbohydrates burn really good, and they're nice and dry, and they burn good, but they didn't last very long, and that's because they don't have as many calories in them. All right, and before we go, interesting thing up here. If we look back at our things up here, our sugar water has in fact begun to turn yellow, okay, just like our corn syrup did. All right, what does that tell us? That when we see it, guess what? The sugars break apart. And then it starts testing positive for some sugar because some of them, at least not all of them, much lighter color than this other one over here. You know, the colors are not nearly as dark, but it is starting to break down. All right, and sometimes we did this time, but sometimes our starch will do that as well because remember, your body breaks off little pieces of starch to make the sugar off and use that for energy. So, but it did not have long enough apparently for this time to do it. All right. Okay, that's it for me. Hopefully you will have, don't forget your quizzes this week. Turn your questions first, then your quizzes. And don't forget we have a major test. So make sure you get that done and have a good week.